Hello, everyone. We've added this note to the beginning of all of our original episodes of the podcast to let you know of a few changes that have happened around here and hopefully avoid any confusion for you as listeners. When we began this podcast, it was called Starseed Survival Guide, and most people called me, your host, by my birth name, Erin. Throughout the first 22 episodes, you'll hear me introduce myself as Erin, hear others refer to me as Erin, and hear many references to the name of the show being Starseed Survival Guide. In 2018, more and more folks began calling us Yaya, and in March of 2020, we changed the name of this podcast to Earthside Survival Guide to more accurately reflect our intentions for the show. For a little more of the full story of what these changes mean to us, please check out episode 23, a temple talk where we reflect on where we've been, where we are now, and where we're going. We thank you for your patience during this transition, for listening and sharing this journey with us, and most importantly, for allowing us to continue to grow and evolve. Blessings.
And as I call in the east, I walk into the stream, and as I call in the south, I bring water to my mouth, and as I call in the west, the creek swallows my chest, and as I call in the north, I am swallowed by her soul.
Greetings, Starseeds, and welcome to the Starseed Survival Guide podcast. I'll be your host, Erin Rivera Merriman, and I'm honored to facilitate a place for us to virtually gather to be seeded, activated, and germinated by the infinite well of galactic and terrestrial wisdom that is available to all in every moment. Thank you for hearing the call, for remembering that there is so very much more to life, and showing up to explore the secret, esoteric, mystical, and unorthodox pathways to liberation that are and forever will be open to you and all who seek them with sincerity. We welcome and hail to the guardians and the gatekeepers who dwell eternally in the liminal realms. We humbly beseech your assistance today in opening these portals between the dimensions so that those who have tuned in with this transmission may find themselves able to listen from a deeper place and receive the hybrid medicine and restructuring that the helper spirits who called this broadcast into being so generously provide. May you as sacred listeners hear what you need to hear and discard anything that is not of value to your own stated intentions for your life and the fulfillment of your soul's purpose in the most enjoyable, most beautiful possible way. Starseed Survival Guide is a listener-supported program, and we hope that if you find value in the experience we share here today, that you might consider offering support by visiting us online at www.activeculturefamily.com and making a purchase or donation. Many blessings to you on your journey, and we hope you enjoy the show.
Hi folks, it's me, Erin, and I'm here today with teacher, Yogini, priestess, and divine feminine scholar Laura Amazzone. Laura is the author of the book Goddess Durga and Sacred Female Power, and has published numerous articles in academic journals and anthologies in the fields of Tantrism, Hinduism, and women's spirituality. She's also contributed entries to the Encyclopedia on Hinduism and the Encyclopedia of Goddesses of World Culture. Laura teaches in the Yoga and Philosophy program at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, online at Mystery School of the Goddess, and privately, offering classes, rituals, and workshops on the goddesses, history, and ritual practices of the Kaula, Shakta, and Tantra traditions into which she has been initiated. Welcome, Laura. It's such an honor to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Erin. It's an honor to be here.
Well, in my understanding, you've been studying Tantra for over 20 years. I'm wondering if you would be willing to just briefly share a little bit about your personal story of how you came to be a leader in this field of women's spirituality that you are today.
Sure. Let's see where to even begin, because so many streams, so many threads kind of weave together for this. guess I would start off by saying that when I was growing up, when I was a little girl, I always had mystical inclinations and had a lot of maybe what would be considered quote unquote supernatural experiences, but they were very natural, very real for me. And yet around me within the very conservative environment in which I grew up, there wasn't really any explanation or any support. And I knew that there was something more, that there was something missing. And so I began seeking kind of to find out, even at an early age. And when I finally went to my undergraduate program, I became one of my majors was women's studies. And that was fascinating, just this whole idea of women's empowerment. And I really wanted to look more into religion. Actually, I should back up and just share a kind of funny synchronicity, because when I share this story, people often are amused by this. Before I even went to university, I had applied, and been accepted at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and had a very difficult upbringing. It was a very abusive, violent household. And so I was eager to leave. And I remember my father saying to me that instead of spending the summer after my senior year at home, that I needed to go to Madison immediately and start studying. So he said, what are you taking? And at that point, I really didn't even know. It wasn't a conscious decision to study women's studies. And so I took the course catalog, opened it up, closed my eyes, and put my finger down. And it said, the meaning of women in Western culture. And that didn't even make sense. I was like, what does that mean? The meaning of women in Western culture. I said, okay, I'll take that. So I went back to him and said, I'm taking that. And he said, no, you're not going to be partying all summer. You're not just taking one class. You need to take another class. And I was like, okay, what am I going to take? And at that point, I did have a relationship with spirit guides. So I was probably calling on them. And so I took the catalog again, opened it up, put my finger down, human sexuality. Wow. So there it was, already there. And little did I know that would open into this whole other, not only professional, but deeply personal and spiritual experience. And so as I was studying, women's studies and did the human sexuality course that summer, I became more and more interested in women and religion and wanted to explore that as well. And so I was looking to see if there were any such programs like that I could enroll in. And I found one in San Francisco at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and this is in the early 90s. And so I went out and met with some advisors there, and they gave me a whole stack of papers to read. And I decided, though, at that moment, and study of these different, goddess cultures and research, but it was relatively new still. The women's spirituality movement had been around, Vicky Noble's work was out, Starhawk, See Budapest, but there really wasn't much else. And of course, we didn't have the internet back then. So I realized in holding all this incredible material that I wanted to explore it on my own before I would commit to a program. And I had actually already been accepted. I'd received a Fulbright teaching fellowship in Europe, and decided I'm going to go to Europe, and I'm going to spend the next few years teaching there, reading this, studying the Mother Peace Tarot, and see where that takes me. And right when I went, pretty soon after I arrived in Europe, I was living in Vienna, my body completely broke down. And first with an illness, paralyzing illness of the sensory nervous system called Guillain-Barré was the diagnosis. I know now that was a Kundalini awakening that I was having, and I just didn't have the proper support. I didn't know. I had no context. I probably didn't even know the word Kundalini, to be honest. And that came later in retrospect. And so that was the first breakdown, and really an invitation to confront what this deep, deep sense of disempowerment that I had experienced my whole life, the shame from the abuse that I had endured, the anger, rage at the injustice towards women, and and people of color, even having that background too in women's studies. So all of that kind of was a big piece of it. And then shortly thereafter, not only was this autoimmune, the effects from this autoimmune or kundalini, whatever that was, I started having major gynecological problems and was diagnosed with endometriosis, was in and out of surgery. And what was so confusing at this time is that I always had felt this love that was inexplicable and just like was really excited about my blood. So for a 13-year-old back in the 80s, in the Midwest, I have no idea, where did that come from, right? That sort of respect or honoring. And so that was part of my own personal spiritual and research inquiry, that despite the tremendous pain that was so debilitating for me, that really was actually creating altered states because it was so severe. And I was having visions even of this beautiful dark goddess who was there at the end of my bed, really, in some of the most challenging times. So all of that really became, it was so personal, but it was like, I need to do something not only to liberate myself, but how can I help others, help support others, especially so often when I'd be laying there in bed or in a hospital somewhere in Vienna, I would think of women who didn't have access to healthcare like this, or women who were still stuck in these abusive environments. I had freed myself from, and had cut off contact with my biological father. But what about women in the developing world who were continuing to suffer? So it really was a deep calling. And I think because of the extent of my own pain and my own suffering, mentally, emotionally, physically, I really went in deep. And so the initial intro was really through the feminist spirituality movement that later evolved into Tantra.
Thank you. I had chills at so many points during your story, just like really resonating. I think a lot of women can resonate with the glimpses of awakening that can come even in really dark times, and it's like stringing those together to find the path, the little points of light.
Exactly. That it's not just meaningless or it's not punishing, because those of us who've grown up, outside of these, outside of an indigenous, spiritual tradition, there's so much programming in these orthodox, these patriarchal religions, especially, well, first of all, where is the Divine Mother, but also we're presented with a God who's punishing, who's outside the body and punishing. And so to be able to liberate ourselves, from that conditioning, that programming, the guilt, the shame, to even see, okay, I may be experiencing extreme physical pain around my sexuality, my cycle, but I'm not being punished. I didn't do anything wrong. This isn't because God is angry, but even if we know that on an intellectual level, I know for myself that pain can take me to really, really intense places in the underworld, but that's part of the journey. And we see this in mythology, this powerful goddess mythology all over the ancient world, not, of course, in South Asia and in the Indian traditions, which are absolutely profound and amazing, especially that they're living traditions, but in the Inanna, Rishkigal myth, and, Demeter and Persephone, you can see this journey that we need to take of confronting what our fears, so-called quote unquote demons, our pain, and integrating, looking at all the ways we've been fragmented.
Thank you so much. So about 3 years ago is when I gave myself permission to just admit how deeply I felt this devotion to Goddess, and it really was like worship for me. And so I didn't really know what that meant, but I felt this urgency to like take a step toward that, and to say like I really like need to restore like some sense of dignity to that aspect of myself, that it's not a small thing, that it's not a small incidental thing. And I asked Spirit to show me a way to go deeper into exploring this. And because I was having really big energetic experiences, really just wanting to like climb out of my skin. I felt like I couldn't contain something, but I didn't even know what it was. And I found myself exploring Tantra. I don't know where I even came to put the sensation inside together with that word. And, exploring online and kind of nervously attending some local workshops, being like, what is this going to be?
Right.
And I knew intuitively that it was meant to be about so much more than sex, but I wasn't really finding that anywhere. Where I live in California, and thankfully was just compelled, like really driven to dig deeper, and that's when I found your work through a friend, and felt a little better when in your book I read that quote that said that there's something like 80 different lineages of Tantra in the East. I was like, oh, well, no wonder it's hard for me to understand what it is, because like it's so many things to so many different people, and even in the areas of the world where it comes from. So I was hoping that you would maybe explain just a little bit for our listeners from your perspective and your lineages, what is Tantra and how is classical Tantra different than Neo-Tantra?
Okay, excellent question, and such an important question for these times. There are many, many different schools within the tantric tradition. It's even difficult to date, when Tantra began. We have some, specific dates that point to certain texts that we would consider tantric and so forth. But there are a lot of elements of it that do seem very reminiscent at times of some of the shamanistic cultures, depending on how you define shamanism. But just a simple definition, or just what attracted me in that term, like Tantra, it comes from the root of two words that mean both to protect and then also illume. It has this weaving quality. So it is a path really of really weaving different strands of experience together, and really finding the unity behind the diversity, appreciating the differences. And this is very, very general. I'm even hesitant to speak to it because this is such a vast, subject. Also, I found for me in the beginning, just to simplify it, that it really was a path of paradox. And it was saying like, life is both, this and that. It's both dark and light. It's not so split as either this or that. It's both joy and sorrow. And it's about an honoring of the cycle of existence. Now, of course, depending on which stream, which lineage, which school, and I'll say a little bit more about that shortly, there are different approaches. There's different deities that are worshipped, celebrated. There's rituals that are performed. But you could say that there are some common characteristics across the board of Tantra. Although, let me also say within that, you have both the non-dual paths and more dualistic paths. But something that they share in common is the use of mantra. So using the sacred syllables, using the sounds, and understanding that these sounds are the vibration of the deity. Yantra, which is a geometric pattern or design, also is another expression of the body of the deity. What did I say? Mantra, yantra, and ritual too. So the different ways that we work with the deities to embody them, because Tantra is very much a path about understanding that the absolute or the transcendent consciousness, whether we refer to it as Brahman or Shiva, as in the Kashmir Shaivite tradition, to put a Sundari and some of the Sri Vijaya traditions, Kali, Durga, in some of the Shakta, which is really kind of the overarching term for all these different lineages. she is both this massive, it is this tremendous expression of consciousness, but it expresses itself both in the transcendent and immanent, or absolute and relative. And the mantra, yantra, the practices, the sadhanas are here to support us. Actually, sadhana, one of the meanings of it is to support. So to support us in our evolution, to support us in our awakening. And then we would ask, what is the aim? Some lineages maybe have more of an aim for that's related more on a worldly level, but I would say ultimately it's liberation, moksha. Liberation from what? From suffering, from bondage, from samsara, right? And understanding too, respecting that we are living in duality, especially on these non-dual paths of Tantra. And so how do we work within that and still hold this understanding that, yeah, this is happening, and yet there is this greater consciousness that is within all of us and to which we will return. So Shakta is, we have different schools, we could say. Cult is often used too, but that's such a loaded word. But really Shakta, which as we define Shakta, really evolved around the 3rd or the 4th century. Also different approaches to the divine within the Shakta tradition. Some with a Shakta will see the supreme deity as Kali, Durga, perhaps, on the fiercer path. Or they may equally say it's one of the more benign, like Lalita or so. So she's the one in the many. So ultimately that this greater consciousness is quote unquote feminine, but not in the Western sense of that word, and it's ultimately beyond gender. Also, there is an understanding that we're not just talking about the goddess as a abstract concept. She's a reality. She's a field of consciousness, and you're not working with her for your personal agenda. Perhaps you would have an intention that you want improvement in your life, but what is the ultimate aim? It's not to get the perfect relationship or the new car or the job or what. Well, that's not something to be dismissed. I've found a lot of times the approach has been more programmed from the Western mindset for that instant gratification, or these more to make our lives quote unquote more comfortable. Tantra is not a comfortable path. Yes, there is the beauty, there's the bliss, there's the wholeness that we can experience within and around us, and yet be prepared to be worked, when you're on this path. And you have tantric schools and lineages within both the Hindu and the Buddhist tradition. So you have that. There's variance depending on, where the lineage traces back to, which gurus, which teachers, who's translated the texts. Another commonality that would be shared pretty much universally, I hate to be so general, but most likely across all lineages, one could say the importance of the guru, of the teacher, to receive the transmissions, that even if you're finding practices in text, and there's so much available now, really there's so much power. Tantra is really a path of power. And it can be misused the way that people exploit, obviously we see this in so many ways, but it's about cultivating our inner power, inner awakening, inner awareness, not as a static or a state, a point that we're going to just arrive at and we're going to be fixed, understanding that we're always in this process of becoming, that there's this dance, I was saying that within Shakta, it's, the supreme deity is Kali or Durga or the Divine Mother, but within another branch of Shakta, the Kaula tradition, which I know may seem familiar to you, that Kali and Durga are important, and also the divine is understood as a union between Shiva Shakti, or Ananda Bhairava, Ananda Bhairavi. And again, even that to say, depending on who the guru is, what text we're referring to, and so forth. So there can be a lot of confusion, understandably. What Tantra is not is the sexual practices that we find here, the California Tantra, the Neo Tantra. There's definitely a need for that work here, probably even we could say all over the world, around intimacy, around embodiment of our sexuality. And but Tantra has been appropriated, and it's been used falsely, wrongly, I find, in a lot of cases, maybe not all, but it is very problematic, because when you are on a tantric path, the sexual practices are a part of it, but not till much later, not until the body is, the physical and the subtle body and the mind is prepared too. So much of the work we're doing in these practices is to decondition the mind, the afflicted mind, these negative thought patterns or these limiting thought patterns. So yeah, there's a lot to it.
Thank you, and I really appreciated just hearing. You cover a lot of these different elements of the practice, the importance of practice, or just even like the reason why you practice, for support and for actually transforming the body to be able to better integrate the big energies that you're maybe courting or maybe not courting, and they're courting you.
I do, yeah.
Yeah. So there's this concept that I wanted to run by you. I recently had this vision. The show is called Starseed Survival Guide, and so I like to kind of at least touch on or acknowledge, like, what does that mean? Or be exploring that with the audience, what that feeling of having like starry origins like means, and how it actually like relates to all of these earth traditions. So I had this vision that lineage holding is kind of an act of like holding open a portal, and that every major lineage on Earth's texts and songs and mantras and practices were all kind of sprinkled with these star codes, like a scavenger hunt, and that all of those traditions were a path complete unto themselves, but for the starseed, there would be this inner knowing that it wouldn't really matter which lineage you found yourself in. You could hunt for these codes and be stringing together this little wisdom garland, and that if you were to like undertake and stick with any practice for long enough, you would find one or two of these little gems to add, and that at some undetermined point, when you like had a critical mass of these star codes, they would like kind of pop open and create like a gateway or a map to another dimension of cosmic magic. And so in this vision, like each lineage is a really important part, like they have a job to do in this cosmic plan, but that it's also small and insignificant in another way. Because if one of those pillars were to fall, there would be, 7 other ones or 10 other ones or however many other ones that would take up the slack. And it's taken me a long time to realize that like other people don't, like there's things I'll say or understand that feel really natural and self-explanatory, intuitive to me, that other people will reflect back like, oh, that's not from here, that's not from here, that's not from here. So I'm wondering if in the tantric tradition or any of the lineages that you've studied, Hinduism, there's any like explicit talk about like wisdom from other dimensions or lifetimes on other planets, or if it simply doesn't like discount that might be someone's reality.
It's a very interesting question. I'm not, let me just think about this for a moment. I mean, there's an understanding and acceptance of parallel realities or other dimensions, and really questioning consciousness. I mean, let's just take it back to this plane for a moment. And, is this reality, this waking state right now, or is this the dream? And who's to say that our dreaming state is not just as real? And so there is an exploration of different states of consciousness, for sure, and these different realms. But the other thing that comes to mind when you say this, and we don't know what the communication was or what the intention, because we're looking at history from symbols. But when I started this research for my master's thesis, I looked to the Saraswati Valley civilization, the Indus Valley civilization, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, and the seal stones that are famous. That area is what is now northern India, Afghanistan, Pakistan. There's a very flourishing civilization that overlaps with Vedic culture, but even predates that, and has earlier roots, even pointing in many different directions. I'm working on a really exciting book with Vicki Noble and Miriam Robbins-Dexter right now on this place, and tracing the goddess throughout history, and Neolithic, Paleolithic, not where history as we've been taught where it begins. And the reason I bring this civilization up is that they're so sophisticated. There is no fortification, there's no evidence of violence or warfare, weapons, very prolific in the arts. Hundreds, thousands of goddess or female figurines were found. And then they have this script that actually is fascinating. And of course, there's a lot of controversy around how to decipher it and so forth. But what we have found is there are references to certain stars or certain constellations that really open a whole field of questions. Were the ancients in communication through how, who knows how, whether it's through their own, visioning or altered states, or were they really able to travel? We don't know, but we do see, for example, seal stones where there are 7 female figurines at the bottom, and even based on research of later collectives of 7 sisters, 7 goddesses that we find in the Hindu traditions, there is a reference to the Pleiades, the constellation of the Pleiades, and how they rose at the spring equinox, apparently, possibly, around 3500 BCE. This is Catherine Ann Harper wrote a PhD dissertation on the iconography of the Saptamatrikas, and it became a book, which is unfortunately out of print, and I no longer have access to it, but this is what I was focusing my thesis on because I found it fascinating. The reason why they thought or that it's, you could say, well, how do you know there's other constellations? Well, if you look at the mythology around this collective of 7 known as the Matrikas, the mother goddesses, who are a collective of goddess Durga, Durga's festivals, her main festivals, take place in the fall around the equinox and in the spring. And apparently the 7 Pleiades were visible, would come above the horizon in the spring equinox, and then go below at the fall equinox, and were a way of dividing the year into light and dark and so forth. And then you could still say, well, so there's still 7, right? But we know that in 1500 BCE, there's another seal, and there's only 6 figures at the bottom. And astronomers had said by that point in history, one of the Pleiades in that constellation no longer was visible to the naked eye. So there's that, and then references to other planets and stars that may or may not be speculative. Of course, there's many ways of knowing, and not always the traditional academic forms of research. They leave a lot, they're pretty limited in some ways. And yet also we need to find a way to not be too far out there. We have to have a balance of both and taking an interdisciplinary approach. So all that to say, I'm sure that there's more, but this is aside from that research and my own fascination with the Pleiades and finding that connection to the Matrikas and the continuity that we find on those seals that still exists, today is very evident in the contemporary rituals around the fall and spring festivals, is fascinating to me. And who knows where these practices really ultimately the origin seed is.
Well, that's all wonderful, and I really look forward to reading this new book that you mentioned that you're working on. That's exciting.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Our last guest on the show, she's a longtime student of a Mayan tradition that, speaks of the process of initiation as, there's sort of a middle level before you would become an elder teacher, wisdom keeper, that they call like a shade tree. And so this idea that the trees that, as you grow, you're becoming, the way I look at it is you're becoming closer to the sun, so more able to tolerate more heat and more direct reality, and that in that process, whether or not your intention is protective, you might be just fully immersed in your own growth journey, but one way or another, you do protect the new growth underneath you in the forest. And so then when you and your writings introduced me to the ideas of the Ajumas and the Matrikas, these groups of, border goddesses, I got really excited just even around the specifics of where the understanding of the sentience of trees and the spirits of trees and how the goddesses and the deities live in the trees. So since you brought up the Matrikas, it kind of brings me to my next question of can you talk a little bit about these collectives we find, like the Matrikas or the Mahavidyas, where it's really, the focus is really not on the individual, it's really on the collective, and why that information might be so inspiring and really being remembered again at this time, really resurfacing at this time.
Absolutely, I'd love to, because even that seal stone I was referencing with the 7 figures, there's a goddess, a female figure in a tree, even back 3500 BC, with a devotee wearing a horned headdress, kneeling before. And then fast forward several thousand years into, the first, century of the Common Era, 2nd century, and we start to see these stone circles that are worshipped. I mean, we even have that in the Neolithic and Stonehenge and Avebury and so forth, but I'm talking about in South Asia. And so these groups, and then you have the trees, like you said, the yakshis and the yakshas, the tree spirits, or these groves, that these are all sacred places where these collectives of deities that are very elemental, very connected to the earth and the elements, and the really natural cycles. And so they start off in these aniconic forms, sort of. You could say, we could look at them both in aniconic form and then also meaning having no form, and then the anthropomorphic, meaning having more of a human form so we can relate. And you see that these earlier forms of tree spirits did evolve into these collectives of 7, 8 mother goddesses, matrikas, the 9 Durgas, and then this is all in the early part of the Common Era, and then entering into the Middle Ages, we find the collective of the Tantric wisdom goddesses. So another collective. What do they represent? Well, first of all, they are the Divine Mother. Each as an individual is an aspect of her, but also contains her essence. But the beauty and the power, I find, is really they express a fuller expression of human experience. To me, what attracted me to the matrikas is going to these temples and seeing the anthropomorphic forms. And here you have really wild, terrifying looking, if I may say, really ferocious goddesses. The next one is all peaceful and, all beautiful, has this very pacifying quality about her. And then the next one may be more sensual and have this erotic presence. And they each are depicted with a different animal or a different mount that they're standing on, whether it's a vegetation or something else. It's so rich in the symbolism and all they represent, but it really helped me to understand myself too, my own nature, my own mind, and that I didn't have to be like, that conditioning of that we so often experience here in the Western Christianity of Mary, that it's so split, the virgin or the whore. I could be both virgin, which the root, the original meaning of that word is whole unto ourselves. And I could also have this very erotic, energy that I was bringing, or I could have my anger in certain points. So on the one hand, on a psychological level, we could say there's that. Also, we can look at it, I feel, too, to the power of working in groups. And there are these female forms, and there's also later male ones, the Bhairavas. So you have the 8 Ashtamatrikas and then the Ashtabhairavas that are very prominent in Nepal, but also in a lot of these Sri Vidya practices. There's references within the Kaula lineage of Sri Vidya, references to them, other Shakta practices. So I'm not saying this is not gendered in that sense. It's available to everyone. And then really it's these circles. How do we work together? Why are we coming together? What are the powers that each of us have as individuals? What is the power we have as a collective, as a group? How can we celebrate our diversity while also remembering that, we share perhaps this, we all come from the absolute. We all come from that great formless, whether we call it Tripura Sundari or Kali or Shiva. So, and they're wild, they're untamable. And like you mentioned too, you're absolutely right. They're goddesses who guard boundaries, the borders. They're goddesses who work on the threshold. So much like that beautiful example of the shade tree, the practitioner. These are goddesses that navigate between the outer, the so-called chaotic, the wild, and then maybe the more quote-unquote contained inner of the village or the city. They're right there on the boundary, protecting. Or is in the case of the yoginis and their temples, which are later between the 9th and the 15th century, you find them in very remote places, very remote locations, very much connected to the natural world. So maybe on a riverbank or in a sacred grove or on a hilltop, but they're connected specifically to vortices within the earth, places within the earth that have power. Perhaps we could say they are a portal of sorts. And that's why the practitioners, we as practitioners or the earlier practitioners, are going to these places. And I think too, it's a reminder there's so much freedom in this, and looking at these deities that ultimately she's one and she has these different expressions. And so it gives us a lot of permission to evolve or to be ourselves, and to not, it's not to say that if you don't worship her, then you're damned. It's like, okay, you worship her as Kali, I worship her as Matangi. She worships her as, Lalita, and so forth. And so there's a way to really honor the uniqueness that every single one of us has, on this planet, whether we are in human or non-human form. So it's also, these collectives are a celebration of the interrelatedness of life, that it's not only humans that have this sort of consciousness. What about the plant consciousness, the vegetative consciousness? What about animal consciousness or stone consciousness? It's a greater field of acceptance, awareness, interrelation, and understanding the interdependence that we all share. And we could extend that, to go back to your starseeding question, to the planets as well, because I will just add that this form, the 9 Durgas, for example, many different ways of understanding them, approaching them, different stages in a woman's life cycle, different evolutionary cycles of our own spiritual process. Each of the 9 Durgas is connected with a different plant and with a different planet. So there you have, again, the goddess in this anthropomorphic form that we're relating to, but we can relate to her in this plant form or in this planet form as well.
Thank you. There was a few things that you mentioned that I wanted to go back to a little bit. Mainly when we're talking about these different collectives, I kind of see them or feel them more abstractly as like maps for ways that energy is moving, and that if you could surrender and participate rather than like resist and control, then like things like my life goes a lot more smoothly. So when I learned about the different groupings, I kind of see, or I like, oh, okay, like that's a way to resolve that problem that I'm bumping up against, or like something. There's some kind of mapping happening there. And then I tend to classify reality into like 3rd, 4th, and 5th dimensions, like different things that I experience or practice, and that would say that all of these collective forms of goddess occur to me as sort of occupying a 4th dimensional space, because I kind of think of the 5th dimension as like so far beyond any mapping or words, but the 4th dimension being kind of like sacred geometries and spirals of patterns, mythologies, stories, ways to understand. And so then in the 3rd dimension, what that really looks like for me is all of these women's circles and women's gatherings and women's collectives of all kinds. If it's a women's weaving collective, or a co-working space, or a temple space, a study group, and have been doing a lot of writing and speaking about the idea of just like the archetype or the label of the like empowering journey of like finding your label. Are you a witch? Are you a priestess? Are you a medicine woman? That there's these subtle differences. So you mentioned the yoginis in that whole last piece, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like what does this mean, yogini? Because prior to meeting you, I really just thought it meant like a female practitioner of yoga. I had no idea that it was like closer to, you know, now I kind of think of it as like, this is Indian covens, you know, like that's just my like horse excited little like inner something that's like, these are witches. But I know it's so much more than that. So just wanted to hear from you, like, what's a yogini? Because I know you have this class, Mysteries of the Yoginis, and I'm only maybe a third of the way through it, but I've learned so many things that excited or intrigued or surprised me.
Yeah, the yoginis are so fascinating, and there are so many. First of all, there are different categories of yoginis, both in the body and then also non-embodied ones. We could even say that the yakshis, the tree spirits we're referencing, these nature spirits, the matrikas evolved into some of these collectives of what we're now referring to as yoginis. She's the practitioner, though. So talking about her in human form, it's the female practitioner. Although one of my teachers says it doesn't necessarily have to be female, but we'll just say for purposes right now that it's the female practitioner who is maybe doing asana, yogasana, but that's not a yogini. And there's even tantric texts that state this outright, that that these yoga asanas, the pranayama practices, and so forth are valuable, but that's not part of the yogini kula. You know, kula is a word for a clan, or is related to the Kaula path. But of course, there's yoginis within different lineages. She's the practitioner, and what is different about her is that there's something. She's a transmitter of this knowledge, of ancient wisdom, that she works with these subtle planes or these fields of consciousness to transmit the teachings to. Often it's a practitioner who has been in, at least within the tantric folds, she has received the initiation from teachers, perhaps even gurus. There's not always a need for that guru, but a guide, a teacher, absolutely. There are, but again, there's variants too. Sometimes they have been described as witches because of their practices. Or in a non-embodied form, there are yoginis related that reside in our subtle body, that reside in the chakras that we can access as well. There's even yoginis that are associated with the planets. But again, to come back to that, the coven thing, yeah, there are a lot of parallels, because yoginis, there are meetings in circle. The circle is significant. We even see that in the temples that we know of in South Asia of them, that these temples are generally round, circular. There are two exceptions, open to the sky, and who knows? Yeah, there's so much that could be said about that, but who knows what kind of practices are being performed there. And, we could even say she's the witch, a priestess in a sense, because the yogini is an attendant of goddess. She's a devotee of goddess. It's a path of being fully committed and devoted to the Divine Mother, and working not only on our own liberation, but to, liberate and alleviate suffering for all. Perhaps is a big part of the agenda. Agenda is a slightly little word. The intention too.
Beautiful. I like that you've brought that back around a couple of times where, there's a lot of beauty in the stories and the practices and the rituals. But that there is for me this gentle and sometimes not gentle reminder, like, don't get lost in just the all of that, because like we have a job to do. Like that all of it comes back to, like, for me, and I feel is confirmed what you're saying, like the alleviation of human suffering.
Yeah.
And the alleviation of suffering, and with the belief that when we're not so preoccupied by our own suffering, then we realize how much our choice to be here affects the planet, and we like take responsibility for making sure that our movements are at least not harming, and hopefully eventually benefiting the planet, like the earth as a living being.
And it's also that, just to take that back to a tantric concept, that you do find throughout these different lineages, the idea of the micro, meso and macrocosm, that the cosmos is all within. So it really starts with us, and it starts with our own healing, transformation, awareness, empowerment, and that mind, that ego is so slippery, because we need it. We have this sense of self, but really we become attached to certain identities or ways we think we should be, because in this relationship or in this community, but and kind of losing sight of really what is the purpose, really, why are we here, and all the ways that we deny our own experience out of fear too, or the way the ego could even trick us into saying, oh yeah, you're enlightened now, you're on this path, look at you look at this, and that's a sure indicator. No, we're not, and so we have these, and there's so much work that does need to be done on this planet, and it doesn't necessarily mean, of course there's room for that, we have to go out too, but a lot of it, we would say, starts with our relationship with ourselves and understanding our own divinity and committing to being disciplined in our own process of transformation and liberation in the name of authenticity too, and being able to live in balance with all, and recognizing that we all have different, and some of us share similar dharmas, purposes, and really being able to connect, not just on these superficial levels, and not in a way too that is spiritually bypassing, really, because there is a lot of work that needs to be done, and this is a path that I think there's even they call it a dangerous path even, and it is, because some of the experiences we have, or if we're too premature, and this isn't to scare people, but to have respect, it can blow us out. We can have a psychotic break. We don't have a container necessarily, or enough communities. Where are the yoginis? Yes, we're finding each other, and not every woman is a yogini, and that's not a problem. That's not even a put down. It's not saying yoginis are superior. It may not be your path this lifetime. And if it is your path, that may be scary too, because it's like, wow, or maybe it's exciting, both exciting and scary, but knowing, all right, I'm in it, and we need to do some work, in the name of transformation, liberation, authenticity, alignment for all.
So, we're talking about the goddess collectives, the, ultimate reality as feminine, which is also perhaps paradoxically beyond gender. It is a fact of my experience that I'm mostly meeting women who are drawn to this path, and really only know a handful of male initiates or males that are on a tantric path with devotion as their primary motivation. And maybe because of this, that brothers are less common, so there's less like direct experience of the male initiate. Maybe that's just like one of my theories as to why, but there seems to be a kind of romanticizing of this myth of Shiva and Shakti, this dance of Shiva and Shakti in that relationship that like really doesn't sit right with me. It like really chafes something inside me, but I don't fully understand, and I want to explore a little bit with you.
Oh, cool.
So from my like early path exploration and reading books and Hindu stories, my understanding is that Shiva is like this wandering forest-dwelling yogi. He lives in the woods. He's dirty. He's ash-smeared. He has long, unclipped fingernails, caked with dirt and tangled mat of dreadlocks. And he's so absorbed in his own spiritual practice that his Shakti needs to like set herself on fire to get him to even notice she's there. And that, you know, he comes to the wedding surrounded by a goblin host and is like this guy that, you know, you definitely don't really want to bring home to your parents, and the one your parents like hate and like makes them cringe when they touch you. So there seems to be a real disconnect here where people are mixing metaphors of like Shiva and Shakti as like my better half or my soulmate, or this like new age romance story of like perfect union, and then the actual complexity of trying of two wild primordial energies trying to dance or understand each other. And so I'm just wondering, like, if you could talk about like what the role of this like Shiva is in Shakta Tantra, what the role of like the male initiate plays, or the path for like a brother who's drawn to this particular lineage. Yeah.
Well, this is excellent. So this is such a rich question. It is. I totally hear you and your questioning, and especially the myths, and a lot of these Hindu myths, unfortunately, have been taken literally in the sense of sometimes have been used as an excuse, for how people relate. I think more of that around the Krishna mythology and the whole Krishna Gopi thing, or Sita Ram, which I find to be one of the most problematic myths ever. So there's that way of interpreting it, and then of course there's always a whole other level of interpretation, but unless we have the background, the full context and philosophies, I see where people are led astray, and where also it can be used as an excuse not to show up, perhaps, in relationship, or to be a certain way, or not question, when that's not really what it's about. For one, let's think of Shiva and Shakti as energies, complementary aspects of consciousness, Shiva being the formless, Shakti being form. And it's a dance between. It exists within each of us, and it exists and plays itself out all around us. You have all these pairings too. What I have found really interesting and empowering personally for myself through the practices of mythology is that in the Hindu worldview, Shakti is more like the yang that we know in the Taoist. She's the activating presence, right? And then you see that with all her arms, and then you have the yin, the lunar, we could say solar lunar, quiescent or receptive active, the quiescent aspect of Shiva, the receptive, the quiet, the passive. So it's about, bridging, it's about integration, it's about honoring the dance between. And then and through the mythology, these stories, yes, sometimes they're instructional, but really without the proper teacher to translate them. Or, it can be used, for example, even the mythology around Lakshmi. There's a wonderful feminist journalist, I quote her in my book, who wrote a book, maybe it's already 15 years old, called Devi, Mrinal Pandey. She grew up in India and said, growing up, to be told to be like Lakshmi meant to be submissive. That means you're going to be the perfect, obedient wife. And how that myth and all the myths around Lakshmi were used against, or kind of used as a way to keep women in line. And so we can see that in this other mythology too. So Shiva has this anthropomorphized form as, the wayward one, the unconventional. He's breaking the rules. What rules? The orthodox, Brahmanic rules. There's a response to that. And yet he has a very wild, erotic presence. And he also has his very ascetic presence. So even within him, his nature, we see Shakti, Shiva, in a sense, or these energies that seem to be opposing playing out. In terms of the male practitioner, the male teacher, there are so many male gurus, right? And which there is a place, and I don't want to make this, polarize this against men versus women. First of all, one of my first Tantra teachers, Amrananda Bhairavan, was wonderful, very gentle and powerful and fierce too, teacher who always said, I'm not a guru and you're Devi. Taking that perspective from that Kaula lineage, you're the one in the female body, you are the goddess. And I'm not. That was so difficult for me to even understand or to even receive or to accept. But having that sort of respect, or having someone coming, a male saying, no, mirroring back my power in a different way, was really incredible, really liberating for me. But then also other teachers that I've sat in with or just heard about, there is always, I don't want to say always, but that problem around the sexual piece, and how often we hear of these male teachers that are sleeping with all their students. Now, they may have another reason or say that it's, for their liberation, healing, but we live in patriarchy still. And I don't know, that there's a lot there that I find to be very potentially damaging. And so many of us, I'll just speak for myself, growing up in this culture that's had such a challenged, afflicted father relationship, so many women still looking for daddy, in these male gurus, and how often is the power acknowledged in women. Again, Nandu Amarananda was acknowledging my power. I'm not saying this is across the board, but there's others where you see that the transmissions don't go all the way down. So there's that. Also, there's Tantra. Don't think of Tantra as it's not necessarily all the different tantric lineages are not empowering to women. If we look at it historically, we see how women were used and exploited in some of the tantric circles, or would say that only to achieve the state of enlightenment, liberation, whatever you want to call it, you need to be with the lowest caste, the darkest skinned woman. So many racist, associations with the practices, and it's not too, I remember Vicky Noble saying, just in talking about it from, in the Tantric Buddhist perspective, and maybe even Miranda Shah, I can't remember, addresses this in her wonderful book on women in Tantric Buddhism and Passion and Enlightenment. But it's like, okay, here we hear all these stories of the yogi, he can, if he has access to the yoni, these sexual practices with this type of woman, he's going to become enlightened, he's going to receive these boons. But what about the woman? I think Vicky has, quoting someone was saying, women are the absent reference. I think it was Judith Simmer Brown in her book. It's like, okay, but where's mention of us getting, because we have the body, we have the cycle, and where are the women? Where are the female practitioners? And you even have bodies of tantric literature, tantric texts that are more female-centered or feel even very quote feminist, in the sense of they really are taking on, you can see directly, these are coming from like 14th, 15th, 16th century. Lorelei Biernacki, in her book Renowned Goddess of Desire, talks about these specific tantras that says, that whoever was writing at the time was like, wait a minute, there's passages like, if a man even insults a yogini by throwing a flower at her, he will never be enlightened. Where is that coming from? Why would we have such statements like that directly challenging the treatment of women and the way that we've been used? There are, of course, practitioners, beautiful male practitioners and initiates that are not like that, and that maybe are more under the wire because it is a secret path. Or are really questioning these stereotypes that we find of gods like Shiva, or this presentation of the yogi that really isn't about an egalitarian relationship, is a whole other thing that's still embedded within the patriarchy.
I like that you are, you have just so much of an understanding of, I guess, coming back to your first study, like just the role of women in Western culture that seems like has translated to your study of Eastern culture, is like, what really is the cultural context and the role of women, and just that body of wisdom that you bring to the more like esoteric information that you teach. I think it's really needed, like, to have that lens that says like, wait a minute, like, what was the context of this story? Yeah, I think something that I did want to mention is more in the realm of like political or social context for contemporary practitioners, where, when I read things or when I do practices, I work on, I think of it as like a little lab, and I'm kind of testing theories and seeing like what checks out over long periods of time as to be like true and helpful. And so I have this theory right now because, a lot of books or talk about the yoginis kind of says like, who are the yoginis? No one knows. And then I find like all these other texts where it's like, no, there's definitely people who know. And so it kind of cues me right away to someone being more like Brahmanic or patriarchal, when they're just like, look at these amazing structures and temples. No one knows what happened there. And I am thinking of it in terms of today's political climate, where people are like, what are we going to do with our authorities being so corrupt? And I kind of have this theory that this was the same thing happening, in India or Nepal or places where they find yogini temples, is that women had these like Brahmanic myths that they were asked to be living within, and that were being oppressed and told, you need a man and you need to be obedient, because how else are you going to live? And rape has been so prevalent throughout time, so it's like, you're going to have children, and then you're going to love those children and have no means for taking care of them unless you are submissive to this man, so that your children can live and eat. And I see this playing out with clients in their relationships, of them just having these beautiful inner mythologies and being so in touch and divinely guided, and then just never being able to take the step they're guided to take because they're afraid of rocking the boat in their relationship, mostly because they have children. Mostly people who don't have children are willing to rock the boat a little and bump up against each other and get there, wherever there is for the individual. But when there's young children at home, there's just so much fear about rocking the foundation for them. And so what I'm finding is that there is a journey for contemporary women of really needing to take that risk that says, I know that I don't need to submit to behavior that is like not respectful in order to live. I know that like there's a loving universe that would never make that true. And so I'm going to decide that I can take care of myself, and I'm just going to go over there with these here women who also believe that we can do this, and we're just going to like eat forage and farm, and we don't actually need money, and maybe we'll find a way to make money or maybe not. So like I see this happening, these movements within communities of just saying like, it's like, oh, I just remembered that I don't actually need my boss to sign, who's a jerk to me, to sign that paycheck, because I don't actually need like $6,000 a month to live. If I just go over there and reestablish my relationship to the land and to the other women, and to have like a supportive group of people who can, be there for each other. And so in my mind, I'm like, that's that's got to be what the yoginis were presented in those cultures, is just being like, you know what, like, we're going to go over there and take care of ourselves and take care of the land, and the land will take care of us, and thus we don't need to put up with anything that we don't want to put up with. And that when you make that choice and you go and you live in that way, then magic happens all around, because everyone's empowered and liberated, and like that, like then the magic reveals itself and like comes in to that kind of container that has less like oppressive structures. It's a long theory.
Well, I think what you're referring to, it's not the yogini, it is in a sense, but remember, not all women are yoginis. What you're speaking to is matriarchy, which is a totally different system than patriarchy. It's not the opposite. And Vicki Noble is in a lot of women scholars have done a lot of work on this. But I remember even 10, 15 years ago, Vicki saying to me, other women around, that women I knew that had children but had become single mothers out of divorce, or exactly what we were talking about, where do we go? Because we don't have a social structure to support us to make these choices. And Vicki would always advise, go create a household together. It's about being in community. If you are hetero, then the men are going to come, or even the men will come and go, right? But what remains, and it's not to say that women's bonds are perfect, because there is a lot of potential. We've all been damaged. We are still living under patriarchy, but that's where I feel looking at collectives like yoginis, this one looks like this, or maybe imagine her life is like this, she's more the healer, this one's the warrior, that there's many different roles, and we find ways to embrace adversity or conflict and transform it, and knowing, okay, we're outside of the nuclear family, but it doesn't mean there's going to be no problems. There's going to still be other issues that may be in the service of, will probably be in the service of our own growth and hopefully awakening. And so I think it's very important that we are able to come together, and because even looking, as you said, like looking at these beautiful, very rich spiritual traditions and philosophies in the East, we see it's not reflected in women's, lives today. There's definitely a disconnect. Maybe some regions it's slightly better than others, but women are not, in terms of human women on the socioeconomic level, are not free. But I do agree that is a first step in knowing that we can that there are alternative communities or alternative ways to come together so that we can be together. And that's, I think, even seeing the importance of circle, of being together for women and men. We have the Astabhairavas too. It's not just something that, I think men need their own communities and own rituals, rites of passage. And I know there's the Mankind Project and other Michael Mead's work, other few, but at least there's some resources for men to get in touch with their spirit, with their soul, with their heart, to experience ritual and a different modeling of being, quote unquote, masculine than the rites of passage of military and all that's presented, or this, these so-called authority figures that we find, running the country, in the US now. So did I answer what you were doing? Okay.
So we're going to start to need to wrap up. You can learn more about intuitive session work or private sadhana instruction by visiting www.lauraamazzone.com, and you can find that link in the show notes on our website as well. You can also use the coupon code Yogini to receive $40 off Laura's 8-module online course, Mysteries of the Yoginis, that we were speaking of earlier in the show, and that I personally really enjoyed. And, just a formal thank you to you, Laura, and all the benevolent beings in all the realms who've gathered here today to inspire and direct the flow of this ritual conversation. We dedicate any merits accumulated through this work to the benefit of all sentient beings. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be well. May all beings know joy and not suffer. Jai Ma, amen, namaste, blessed be, aho, may it be finished in beauty.
Jaima. Thank you so much, Erin.
Soldiers laying down their guns, swords and bullets. We are leaving the timelines of war. The warrior becomes a guardian. No shame of defeat, no rage and righteousness, just heart planting gardens. Take me through my shadows, show me my fellow man, help me find the sanctuary every place I am. I am. Heaven on earth, sanctuary of the womb, the great birthing ground. No longer victims of circumstance, no longer the target of unresolved pain. I want to heal the distance between our hearts and minds, between our beliefs and our doubts. Generations of separation. I am.